Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another beautiful Wednesday afternoon. I hope you guys are all having a great week as always, with Christmas coming up really soon. Whether you celebrate it or not, it is almost the end of the year. So I hope you all are having a great time and getting ready to start the next year with a blast. Today, we are going to be going over some basic sound design techniques, specifically additive and subtractive synthesis. So without further ado, let's get right into the lesson. So let's start with the very bare bone basics of synthesis. What is synthesis? What are the different types of synthesis? What do they do? For today, we're just going to be focusing on additive and subtractive. Additive and subtractive synthesis are usually what people think of as the basics of sound design when they're working with synths, because pretty much any synth can do additive and subtractive at the same time. And they're a really bare bone basic skill and concept that is crucial to learning how to create your own synthetic sounds. There are naturally, as always, more advanced techniques. There's AM synthesis, FM synthesis, there's modulation effects, there's a whole bunch of other things to delve deeper into, which we will be doing in the future, rest assured. But let's start with additive synthesis. Additive synthesis is very simple. In front of me here, you can see I have Serum from X for Records and Massive from Native Instruments pulled up in front of me. These are some of the more common synths that you might find in today's production world. Serum is extremely popular in electronic music production, and Massive is one of the synths that they give you when you buy like the complete ultimate package with Native Instruments, and it's an amazing tool to have as well. Both can create amazing diversity of sounds, and more importantly, both can do additive and subtractive synthesis very easily and in a lot of cases visually, so they're great for the purpose of our demonstration. So additive synthesis is actually very simple. You take one waveform and you add it to another waveform and you play them both back at the same time. Let's take a look at an example of this in Serum. As you can see over here on oscillator A, we have this sort of basic sine wave. Now, if I go in here and I load up a basic sine wave and I play our Serum patch, we have sort of a really basic starting point for a sort of synth sound. And that is just the result of adding together a saw wave and a sine wave. That's all additive synthesis is. You're adding one wave to another. You're not doing any sort of special modulation or any sort of special effects. It's just adding one thing to another thing, putting them together to make a new thing. 1 + 1 is 2. Now, of course, you aren't limited to doing this with just two waveforms. You can add as many as you like. I could add this sub oscillator in here, add a square wave, makes it more unique, adds a little bit more character. If I was planning on making more detail into this using just Serum, I could load up a second Serum patch and just stack layers upon layers. In the case of Massive, it's exactly the same thing. You go in, you pick out your different waveforms, you get sort of this additive sound. Now, you might hear that there's a bit of a difference, and that's just because I'm using different waves between the two synths. Each synth characteristically has its own unique sound. That's something that is characteristic of every single synthetic instrument that you use regardless. They will all have their own sort of character. But that's all additive synthesis is you're taking one waveform, adding it to another. Subtractive synthesis is even less complicated. And you would assume by its name that subtractive synthesis is the exact polar opposite of additive synthesis. But it's actually a bit different. In additive synthesis, we are focusing on the waveforms, we're combining them together. In subtractive synthesis, all you're doing is removing certain parts of the sound. You're applying either a filter or an EQ or some other effect that is cutting frequencies, dipping some parts of it out, and subtracting from the original sound. In the case of Serum again, I can just simply turn on this filter and boom, additive and subtractive synthesis in one go. And you can change the amount of subtractive synthesis done just by modulating the filter, changing some of the settings, moving the cutoff around, moving the resolution, and just playing around with the sound a bit more. If you want to get crazy with it, you can even change up your envelope, add it to the cutoff, and you know what? within that few seconds, you've just created a very easy, sort of simple pluck. Very simple, very easy. And that is sort of the basics of synthesis. Very simple, very easy. You're just adding and subtracting a few things together. Now, in the case of the more complex synths of today, Serum, Massive, there are a lot more options to choose from. They both have their own LFOs, they have envelope modulation, they have their own effects sections. There's just a whole bunch of little mechanics and tools that you can use to add for the character into your sound. Unfortunately, those aren't the focus of today's video, so we're going to be moving on from there and going into some practical examples. When using subtractive synthesis, it is more commonly used as sort of a cleanup tool. When you're doing a lot of additive synthesis together, the high end of your sound, in essence, becomes very populated with a whole bunch of hiss, sometimes crackle, a whole bunch of unwanted high-end frequencies that can make synths unpleasant to the ear. They become unnaturally sharp. There's just too much high-end. In terms of basic synthesis techniques, adding a little bit of subtractive synthesis, adding a filter, adding an EQ, cutting out a little bit of high-end will give it a bit more of a warmer character. It'll darken it down a bit. It'll take out all those unwanted high frequencies and make your sound a bit more pleasing, which is why subtractive and additive synthesis paired together is so popular. Now, using this information that we've had, let's go into a couple techniques real quick of how we can use additive and subtractive synthesis to just get some basic synth sounds, some plucks, some pads, maybe some basses added in. I'll use Serum for some examples. I'll use Massives for some examples. To start, let's start out with Serum. Now, I already showed you a really easy way to get a pluck with Serum. All you gotta do is add in some shapes, add in a filter, add in some additive and subtractive synthesis, good to go. Now, of course, you can change the wave you're working with and it'll change the characteristic of the sound. And that is the essence of how you would get a sort of plucky sound with additive synthesis. You just play around with the different waveforms and you eventually come up with a very good, clean pluck. Getting a chord or pad sound is as easy as changing the envelope feature down here. And all of a sudden, of course, we're going to want to add in some of our subtractive synthesis, take out a little bit of that unpleasant high end, which you could hear. And a great way to get a really strong bass, actually, using the basics of these sound design sort of parameters, is to actually just take some of this and turn your octaves down. It's a really basic step and it can get you where you need to be. And if you want, you can add in that sort of plucky feature by changing your envelope back down to a pluck. Now, going over to Massive, the concepts are always the same. It's the same way to add, same way to subtract. The way that the effects and the envelopes are mapped are a little different, but everything is the same. We've got our basic sound already made. We can go into the envelope here and we can change it to have more of a pluck. We can add in our filter here and we can then modulate the cutoff. And if we want a bass using the same techniques of additive and subtractive, we can just turn the octaves down a little bit. And if you want a nice chord sort of sound, turn those pitches back up, give your sound some sustain, and boom, you have this beautiful chord already. So as I said, these are extremely basic examples. This is the very first stepping stone if you want to learn how to create your own sounds with any sort of synth. However, if you're unfamiliar with any synths or if you've never worked with a synthesizer before, this can be a really good resource if you're looking to start and make your own synthetic sounds. We'll be delving more and more into different synthesis techniques in the future, and I hope you stick around because we are going to be getting into a lot more complicated and fun stuff. But until then, I hope you guys have a Merry Christmas. It's coming up to us very soon, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week. But for now, have a good one.